Maria never expected her kidney to return. 10 years ago, she signed papers in a sterile hospital room, donating part of herself to a stranger whose name she would never know, whose face she would never see. She walked away lighter, both in body and spirit, believing that some acts of love require no witness. But today, standing before a gleaming hospital wing bearing her name, Maria Delgado learns that kindness is never truly anonymous. The man whose life she saved has spent a decade searching, and his gratitude has built something that will save thousands more. Subscribe to witness how one selfless act becomes eternal. Maria Delgado had never considered herself extraordinary, and perhaps that was precisely what made her decision 10 years ago so quietly revolutionary. She was a nurse, yes, but not the kind whose name appeared in hospital newsletters or whose photograph hung in administrative hallways celebrating years of service. She was the nurse who worked the night shift, who held the hands of patients when their families had gone home, who knew that healing happened in the small hours when the world outside the hospital windows grew dark and still. Her life had been built on these invisible acts of care, on showing up day after day to a job that demanded everything and acknowledged little. When the transplant coordinator approached her about becoming a living donor, Maria did not hesitate the way most people would have, did not consult family or weigh the risks against some imagined reward. She simply asked when they needed her, as if offering a part of her body was no different than offering an extra shift or a comforting word. The decision felt natural to her, inevitable even, like water flowing downhill toward the place it was always meant to go. The surgery took place on a Tuesday morning in late April, when the desert around Phoenix bloomed with wildflowers that would wither within weeks under the coming summer heat. Maria remembered the cool touch of the preoperative room, the way the anesthesiologist's voice had been gentle and professional, the sensation of surrendering consciousness while strangers prepared to open her body and remove something vital. She had signed papers ensuring her anonymity, had specifically requested that no information about the recipient ever reach her. This was not modesty exactly, though Maria possessed that quality in abundance. It was something deeper, a belief that the act itself should be pure, untainted by expectation or the human tendency to make transactions out of gifts. She did not want gratitude. She did not want updates or letters or the weight of someone else's emotional debt. What she wanted was simpler and more complex all at once. She wanted to save a life the way a tree gives shade, without agenda, without need for recognition, because that was what her body could do and what her heart demanded. When she woke from surgery, groggy and aching, the first thing she asked the nurse attending her was whether the transplant had been successful, and when the answer came yes, Maria closed her eyes and felt something settle in her chest, a peace she had not known she was seeking. Recovery was harder than the doctors had predicted, though Maria never complained, not even when the incision site burned with each breath or when exhaustion pulled her under like a riptide. She took her medical leave, spent long afternoons in her small apartment, watching the light move across the walls, feeling the strange absence in her body where something had been and now was not. Her sister Rosa visited daily, bringing soup and worry in equal measure. Unable to understand why Maria had done this thing for someone she would never meet, Rosa was practical, always had been, the kind of person who balanced checkbooks to the penny and planned her life in careful increments. She could not fathom giving away something as precious as a healthy organ to a stranger, could not see past the risk to the mysterious mathematics of grace that Maria understood instinctively. They argued about it once, voices rising in Maria's cramped kitchen, Rosa's hands gesturing wildly as she demanded to know what Maria had gained from this sacrifice. Maria had looked at her sister, at the fear beneath the anger, and said simply that she had gained nothing, which was exactly the point. The conversation ended there, a wall between them that would take months to dismantle, but Maria did not regret her words or her choice. She knew that some truths could not be explained, only lived. Returning to work was like slipping back into a familiar skin. Though Maria noticed, she moved through the hospital differently now. With a heightened awareness of fragility and resilience, she saw her patients not just as cases or conditions, but as people carrying invisible burdens, fighting battles that would never make headlines or inspire news stories. There was Mrs. Chen in room 304, dying slowly from kidney failure. Her family gathered around her bed in shifts, and Maria would adjust her IV with extra tenderness, thinking of the stranger somewhere in the city whose kidneys now function because of her. There was young Danny Rodriguez, 17, and recovering from a car accident, his body healing in the miraculous way young bodies do, and Maria would check his vitals while silently celebrating the gift of resilience that lived in human flesh. The hospital became a cathedral of sorts, each room a chapel where small miracles and quiet tragedies unfolded simultaneously, and Maria moved through it all with the reverence of someone who understood that life was borrowed time, that every heartbeat was a gift we did not earn but received anyway. Her colleagues noticed the change in her, though they could not name it, saw something deeper in her eyes during shift change. Something that looked like wisdom or sorrow, or perhaps both intertwined. The years passed the way years do in professions of service, marked not by promotions or achievements, but by the accumulation of small moments that build a life. Maria celebrated birthdays alone or with Rosa, who had eventually forgiven her, had even admitted years later that she admired what Maria had done, though she still could not imagine doing it herself. Maria dated occasionally, brief relationships that flickered and faded, not because she was closed to love, but because she had already given the deepest part of herself away to someone she would never know. And perhaps that had satisfied something in her that romance could not reach. She worked her shifts, paid her bills, lived quietly in a world that spun faster and louder with each passing year. A world that seemed increasingly disconnected from the values that had shaped her decision a decade ago. Sometimes, late at night, after a particularly difficult shift, Maria would lie in bed and wonder about the person whose life she had saved, would imagine them somewhere in the darkness, breathing and living and loving, carrying her kidney inside them, like a secret they shared across the distance of anonymity. She did not regret the choice to remain unknown, but she would be lying if she claimed she never wondered, never felt the faint pull of curiosity about the life her sacrifice had made possible. On the 10th anniversary of her surgery, Maria worked a double shift, not because she had to, but because the hospital was short-staffed and she could not say no to need, had never been able to. She came home as dawn broke over the city, the sky bleeding pink and gold across the desert horizon, and she stood on her small balcony with a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands, thinking about time and legacy and the strange mathematics of a life well lived. She was 50 years old, her body carrying the marks of her choices and her years, a thin scar on her abdomen hidden beneath her scrubs, a testament to what she had given and what she had become. Maria did not know that, in a boardroom across the city, plans were being finalized for a hospital expansion, did not know that her name had been spoken in meetings she would never attend, did not know that gratitude, like water, finds its way to the surface no matter how deeply buried. She finished her coffee, went inside, and slept the dreamless sleep of the exhausted and the just, unaware that everything was about to change, that the gift she had given without expectation was about to return to her transformed, magnified, made visible in ways she could never have imagined. The invitation arrived on a Thursday afternoon, slipped into Maria's employee mailbox between a memo about updated safety protocols and a flyer for the hospital's annual fundraising gala. It was formal, printed on heavy cream-colored cardstock, The kind of invitation Maria associated with weddings or retirement parties for administrators she had never met. She almost discarded it, assuming it was another event she would politely decline, another opportunity to make small talk with people who did not understand the world she inhabited on the night shift. But something made her pause, made her read the elegant script that invited her to attend the dedication ceremony for the hospital's new Sterling Delgado wing, scheduled for the following Saturday at 2 in the afternoon. Maria read her own name 3 times, certain there had been a mistake, that another Delgado worked somewhere in the sprawling hospital system, and this invitation had been misdirected. She carried the card to Human Resources, her heart beating strangely in her chest, and asked the woman behind the desk if there was an error, if perhaps the invitation had been meant for someone else. The woman, a cheerful administrator named Janet, whom Maria had known for years, looked at her with something like awe and said, "No, Maria, this is for you, and congratulations," though Janet herself did not seem to know what she was congratulating Maria for. The days between the invitation and the ceremony passed in a blur of confusion and mounting anxiety that Maria could not name or explain. She tried to continue her routine, working her shifts with the same dedication she always had, but her mind kept returning to the invitation, to the hyphenated name that linked her to someone called Sterling, a name she did not recognize but that resonated somewhere deep in her memory, like a song she had heard once and forgotten. She asked her supervisor if she knew anything about the new wing, about why Maria's name was attached to it, but the supervisor only smiled mysteriously and said she should attend the ceremony, that all would be explained there. Rosa, when Maria called her in a rare moment of vulnerability, was ecstatic, convinced that Maria was finally receiving the recognition she deserved, though for what Rosa could not say. Maria tried to feel excited, tried to embrace the possibility that something good was happening, but instead she felt exposed, as if a private part of herself was about to be dragged into light she had never sought. The anonymity she had insisted upon a decade ago had been a shield, and now she sensed that shield cracking, that the careful boundaries she had constructed around her gift were about to be shattered. Saturday arrived bright and cloudless, the kind of day that made the desert beautiful and merciless in equal measure, the sun a hammer against the earth. Maria dressed carefully, choosing a simple navy dress she had worn to her niece's graduation, nothing fancy but respectful, appropriate for an occasion she did not understand. She drove to the hospital, her hands steady on the wheel, but her stomach churning with nerves that felt foreign to her. This woman who had faced emergencies and trauma with calm competence for 3 decades. The hospital parking lot was fuller than usual for a Saturday, and Maria had to park in the overflow area, walking across hot asphalt toward the main building where a crowd had gathered near the south entrance, where construction had been ongoing for the past 2 years. She had watched the new wing rise from the ground during her shifts, had seen the steel framework go up and the walls take shape, but she had never paid it much attention, had never imagined it had anything to do with her. Now, approaching the gathering of people in business attire and summer dresses, Maria felt like an imposter, like someone who had wandered into the wrong story. A woman with a clipboard spotted her, checked her name against a list, and ushered her toward the front of the crowd with a deference that made Maria uncomfortable. She found herself standing near a podium draped in the hospital's colors, beside administrators she recognized only vaguely, and a man she did not know at all, a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes that seemed to be searching the crowd for something or someone. The hospital's CEO, Dr. Raymond Cardenas, stepped up to the microphone, and the crowd quieted, hundreds of faces turning toward the podium with expectation. Dr. Cardenas spoke about growth and community, about the hospital's commitment to serving all patients regardless of their ability to pay, about the generous donation that had made this expansion possible. Maria listened with half her attention, still puzzled about why she was standing here, until Dr. Cardenas said her name, said it clearly and with emotion, and suddenly every eye in the crowd was on her, and Maria felt the ground shift beneath her feet, as if the earth itself had betrayed her. The CEO spoke of a nurse who had given one of her kidneys to a stranger 10 years ago. Spoke of selflessness and sacrifice, words that made Maria want to disappear into the pavement beneath her. He spoke of a man who had received that kidney, a man whose life had been saved, who had spent years trying to find his anonymous donor, who had finally succeeded and wanted to honor her in a way that would help countless others. Maria's vision blurred at the edges, her breath coming short, and she felt a hand on her elbow, steadying her, and she turned to see the silver-haired man beside her, his eyes bright with tears, and he whispered, "Thank you, Maria. Thank you for giving me 10 more years with my grandchildren, 10 more years I would never have had." The world telescoped down to his face, to the gratitude written there, to the impossible revelation that this was him, the stranger who had received her kidney, who had carried a part of her inside him all this time. His name was Richard Sterling, and he was a real estate developer, a man of considerable wealth who had built shopping centers and office buildings across the Southwest. And when his kidneys had failed, and the waiting list had stretched years into the future, Maria's gift had arrived like grace itself, unexpected and undeserved. Richard Sterling stepped up to the microphone, and Maria stood frozen beside him, unable to process the enormity of what was happening. He spoke about the day he received the transplant, about waking up in recovery and knowing that a stranger had saved his life, had chosen to endure surgery and risk and recovery so that he could live. He spoke about the frustration of the anonymity laws, about hiring investigators and making inquiries that all led nowhere, about the years of searching that seemed futile until a retired transplant coordinator, moved by his persistence, had finally bent the rules just enough to point him in Maria's direction. He spoke about his decision to fund the new hospital wing, about insisting it be named for both of them, Sterling Delgado, a permanent testament to what she had given and what it had meant. And then he turned to her, this man whose life she had saved without knowing his name or his face, and he said, "Maria Delgado gave me everything without asking for anything in return. The least I can do is make sure her kindness lives on in these walls, in every patient who walks through these doors, in every life that is saved here, because this wing exists. She is a hero who never wanted to be called one, and that makes her the truest kind of hero there is." The applause that followed Richard Sterling's words crashed over Maria like a wave, thunderous and relentless, and she stood paralyzed in its wake, her hands clasped in front of her, her face burning with an emotion she could not name. It was not pride, exactly, though perhaps there was a thread of that woven through the confusion and overwhelm. It was not embarrassment, though she felt exposed in a way that made her skin prickle with discomfort. It was something closer to vertigo, the sensation of standing on a precipice she had not known existed, looking down into a depth of consequence she had never imagined when she signed those papers a decade ago. The crowd was full of faces she did not know, colleagues she recognized only in passing, administrators who had never spoken her name before today, and all of them were looking at her as if she was someone different, someone special, someone other than the night shift nurse who preferred to work in the shadows. Richard Sterling was shaking her hand, his grip firm and warm, and Maria saw tears on his cheeks, saw the rawness of his gratitude written in every line of his face, and she understood for the first time that her gift had not ended in an operating room 10 years ago, but had continued living, breathing, shaping a life she had never witnessed. After the ceremony, after the ribbon had been cut, and the crowd had been invited to tour the new wing, Maria found herself surrounded by people wanting to thank her, to touch her arm, to tell her how inspiring she was. The hospital's marketing director asked if she would be willing to do an interview for the local news, to share her story so that others might be inspired to become donors. A woman from the transplant registry approached with pamphlets and statistics, talking about how one story like Maria's could save dozens of lives by encouraging others to register. Maria smiled and nodded, said she would think about it, all the while feeling like she was watching this happen to someone else, like her consciousness had separated from her body and was observing from a safe distance. She wanted to run, to escape to her car and drive home and pretend this had never happened. But Rosa was there, beaming with pride, and Richard Sterling was introducing her to his wife Catherine, an elegant woman with kind eyes, who hugged Maria as if they were old friends, and Maria felt trapped by politeness and expectation, unable to voice the strange grief rising in her chest. The new wing was beautiful, Maria had to admit, as she was guided through its gleaming hallways by Richard and Dr. Cardenas. The walls were painted in soothing colors, soft blues and greens that reminded her of water and growing things, and the patient rooms were larger than the old ones, with windows that let in generous amounts of natural light. There were family waiting areas with comfortable furniture, consultation rooms, where doctors could speak with loved ones in privacy, and a dedicated transplant unit with state-of-the-art equipment that would allow the hospital to perform more surgeries and save more lives. Richard pointed out details with the enthusiasm of someone who had poured not just money, but heart into this project. And Maria listened while feeling a strange disconnection from it all, as if her name on the building was a mistake, a cosmic error that would be corrected once someone realized she was just an ordinary woman who had made one decision that felt right at the time. Near the main entrance to the wing, there was a plaque, bronze and dignified, that read, "The Sterling Delgado Wing, dedicated to the power of selfless giving and the lives transformed by generosity." Maria stared at her name cast in metal, permanent and public, and felt something inside her crack. That evening, after the ceremony had ended and the crowds had dispersed and Maria had finally escaped to her car, she drove not home but out into the desert, following roads she knew by heart until the city fell away behind her and there was nothing but sand and scrub and the vast, indifferent sky. She parked at an overlook she had discovered years ago, a place where she sometimes came when the hospital felt too heavy, when she needed to remember that the world was larger than suffering and fluorescent lights. The sun was setting, painting the horizon in shades of amber and crimson, and Maria sat on the hood of her car and let herself feel everything she had been holding back all day. She cried, which surprised her because she was not a woman given to tears. But the crying felt necessary, a release of pressure that had been building since she opened that invitation. She cried for the anonymity she had lost, for the privacy that had been stripped away without her permission, for the weight of being called a hero when she had only done what felt human and right. She cried for Richard Sterling, for the life he had lived these past 10 years because of her, for the grandchildren he had mentioned, for all the joy and sorrow and ordinary moments he had experienced because her kidney kept him alive. And she cried because she knew her life had changed irrevocably, that she could never go back to being invisible, that her one act of kindness had become public property in a way that terrified and humbled her in equal measure. When the tears stopped, Maria sat in the gathering darkness and thought about what it meant to give without expectation, and then to have that gift returned in a form she had never wanted. She thought about Richard Sterling's face, about the genuine gratitude she had seen there, and she recognized that his need to thank her was as real and valid as her need to give anonymously had been. She thought about the hospital wing, about the patients who would be treated there, about the lives that would be saved in rooms bearing her name, and she understood that her gift had been multiplied in ways she could never have achieved alone. Perhaps, she thought, this was what happened when kindness met resources, when compassion encountered the means to amplify itself. Perhaps her discomfort was a small price to pay for the good that would flow from that building, for the transplants that would happen there, for the families who would get to keep their loved ones, because Richard Sterling had the wealth to turn gratitude into infrastructure. The thought did not erase her anxiety, did not make her comfortable with the attention. But it gave her a framework for understanding, a way to accept what had happened without feeling like she had betrayed her original intention. Driving home under a sky crowded with stars, Maria made a decision. She would not hide from what had been revealed, would not run from the recognition even though every instinct told her to retreat. She would accept Richard Sterling's gratitude with grace, would honor his need to honor her, because that was also an act of kindness, perhaps harder than the original gift had been. She would do the interview if they still wanted her, would share her story if it might help someone else make the choice she had made, would use this unwanted spotlight to shine light on the need for donors and the beauty of giving without expectation of return. And then, when the attention faded, as all attention eventually does, she would return to her work, to her patients, to the quiet life she had built, carrying this new chapter as she had carried everything else, with humility and strength and the understanding that we do not always get to choose how our gifts are received or remembered. Maria Delgado, nurse and donor and now namesake of a hospital wing, drove through the desert night toward home, toward whatever came next, toward a future she had not planned, but would face with the same courage that had led her to give a part of herself to a stranger a decade ago. The weeks following the dedication ceremony unfolded in ways Maria had not anticipated, bringing changes both large and small to the carefully ordered world she had constructed around her work and her solitude. The local news segment aired on a Tuesday evening, and Maria watched it in her living room with Rosa, cringing at the sound of her own voice describing the decision to donate, at the way the reporter framed her as an angel of mercy when Maria knew herself to be simply human, flawed and uncertain like everyone else. But the response was immediate and overwhelming. The hospital's transplant registry saw a surge in new donor applications, people calling to say they had been inspired by Maria's story, that they wanted to do what she had done, to give a stranger the gift of life. Dr. Cardenas sent Maria a personal email thanking her for the publicity, noting that 3 people had already registered, specifically citing her interview as their motivation, and Maria read the message with a mixture of pride and disbelief, understanding for the first time that her private act had become a catalyst for others, that the ripple she had created was still spreading outward in ways she could measure and ways she could not. Richard Sterling called her a week after the ceremony, his voice warm and familiar in a way that surprised her, asking if she would meet him for coffee, if they could talk beyond the formality of speeches and public events. Maria hesitated, not because she disliked him, but because she feared the intimacy of truly knowing the person who carried her kidney, feared that it would make the gift feel less pure somehow, more transactional. But his voice held such genuine kindness, such honest desire to simply know her, that she agreed. And they met at a small cafe near the hospital, a place Maria had been going for years, without ever imagining she would sit there with the man whose life she had saved. Richard brought photographs, pictures of his grandchildren, whose faces Maria had never seen, but whose existence she had made possible. He showed her images of a 5th birthday party, a kindergarten graduation, a family vacation to the Grand Canyon, moments that would not have happened without her, and Maria felt the weight of those unlived lives. The ghost version of a world where Richard had died waiting for a kidney that never came, where those children grew up without their grandfather, where Catherine Sterling had become a widow instead of spending her golden years traveling and laughing with the man she loved. They talked for hours that first meeting, and then it became a pattern, a weekly coffee that Maria found herself looking forward to despite her initial resistance. Richard was easy to talk to, unpretentious despite his wealth, genuinely interested in her life and her work in a way that felt respectful rather than intrusive. He told her about his business, about the satisfaction of building things that lasted, about the hollowness he had felt when his kidneys failed, and he faced the possibility that all his success meant nothing if he could not be there for his family. He spoke about the transplant with reverence, about waking up in recovery and feeling the miracle of his body working again, toxins clearing from his blood, energy returning to limbs that had grown weak and heavy. He had known immediately that he wanted to find his donor, had felt it as a moral imperative, a debt that transcended money or conventional gratitude. When Maria asked him why the hospital wing, why such a grand gesture, Richard had looked at her with those kind eyes and said, "Because your gift was extraordinary, and extraordinary gifts deserve extraordinary gratitude. Because I wanted your name to outlive both of us, to stand as proof that ordinary people can do heroic things." The Sterling Delgado wing opened fully to patients in early autumn, and Maria found herself walking its halls during her breaks, watching the transplant unit fill with patients who would benefit from the expanded capacity and advanced equipment Richard's donation had provided. She met a young mother receiving a kidney from her sister, watched them embrace in a patient room with tears of relief and joy, and Maria thought about how her gift had created the space for theirs, how acts of kindness built upon each other like stones in a foundation. She met an elderly man awaiting a liver transplant, his family camped out in one of the comfortable waiting areas, and she saw how the design of the space allowed them to maintain hope even in their exhaustion. The nurses who worked in the new wing spoke about it with pride, about how much easier it was to provide care when the environment supported them, when they had the right tools and adequate space. And Maria understood that Richard's gratitude had benefited not just patients, but everyone who worked to heal them, multiplying the impact of her original gift in ways that seemed almost miraculous. One evening in late October, as the desert air finally cooled and the summer's brutal heat released its grip on the city, Maria stood alone in the wing after her shift had ended, the hallways quiet and dim with night lighting. She walked slowly past patient rooms where people slept or suffered or healed, past the nurses' station where her colleagues prepared medications and updated charts, past the plaque with her name on it that still made her uncomfortable when she saw it. She thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment, about the decision she had made in a different lifetime when she was 40 and alone and searching for meaning in the endless repetition of work and home and work again. She thought about the operating room where they had taken her kidney, about the stranger in the next room receiving it, about the decade of not knowing that had followed. She thought about Richard Sterling searching for her, about his persistence and his eventual success, about the weight of his gratitude that had seemed unbearable at first, but had become, over these months, something like friendship. And she thought about all the people who would pass through these doors in the years to come, all the lives that would be saved or eased or extended, because one man wanted to say thank you in the biggest way he knew how. Maria left the hospital that night, feeling something she had not felt in a very long time, something that might have been peace, or might have been purpose, or might have been the simple recognition that her life had mattered, that the choice she made had echoed far beyond the boundaries of her own small existence. She drove home through streets she had driven 10,000 times, past houses lit from within by the lives of people she would never know, under a sky scattered with stars whose light had traveled unimaginable distances to reach her eyes. Tomorrow she would return to work, to her patients and her routines, to the quiet, anonymous service that had always been her calling. But tonight, Maria Delgado allowed herself to feel proud, to accept that being recognized for kindness did not diminish the kindness itself, that her gift had been pure regardless of what came after. She thought about Richard Sterling and his grandchildren, about the hospital wing bearing her name, about the donors who had registered because of her story, and she understood finally that some acts of love are too large to remain invisible, that they insist on being witnessed and celebrated and multiplied, and that perhaps that was not a violation of their purity, but the fullest expression of their power. The way one candle lights another and another until the darkness is transformed not by grand gestures, but by the accumulated glow of ordinary people choosing again and again to give what they have for the sake of what might be.